My son said, "Can't you just be quiet and live like other seniors?" I said, "Noted." Then I stopped Sunday dinners, changed the locks, and hid the $350,000 offer he thought could save him. I want to tell you exactly how that dinner happened, because the way it started matters. It didn't start with a fight. It didn't start with anyone raising their voice. It started the way most devastating things start, quietly, at a table set with good china, with food going cold, while a man who should have known better chose the wrong moment to say exactly what he'd been thinking for a very long time. It was the third Sunday in October. The light through the dining room windows had that low amber quality that only comes in autumn, and I had spent the better part of the day making a meal that nobody asked about and everybody ate. Hot roast, slow cooked for 6 hours. Homemade rolls, because I'd been making homemade rolls for Sunday dinners since my son was 7 years old and told me the ones from the bakery tasted like cardboard. Roasted carrots with honey and thyme. Apple pie from scratch with the lattice crust I'd been making since before he was born. I'm telling you the menu because I want you to understand what was on that table. Not just food. 40 years of habit and love and effort compressed into a single afternoon. I was 65 years old, and I had been setting that table since I was 25, and I had never, not once, done it expecting a thank you. I did it because my late husband used to walk through the front door and close his eyes when the roast was in the oven and say that nowhere in the world smelled better than our house on a Sunday afternoon. He'd been gone for 2 years. I was still cooking for 3. My son arrived with his wife at 1:20. They were supposed to be there at noon. I put the rolls back in the oven to warm, and I poured them each a glass of water, and I asked about their week. His wife talked about a lake house trip they were planning. My son talked about a client meeting. He was on his second plate before I said anything. I said the weekends had been getting long, that since his father passed, the house had a lot of square footage for one person, and I'd been feeling it more on Saturdays, that maybe we could find something to do together occasionally. A museum, a walk, even just coffee. Nothing demanding. He hadn't looked up from his plate once since I started talking. He set his fork down. He looked at me, and he said it. "Can't you just be quiet and live like other seniors?" 4 seconds of silence. Maybe 5. His wife did the head tilt. Slight. Almost imperceptible. The one that means I'm with him on this. I just don't want to be the one who said it. I looked at my son. The face I had sat with in emergency rooms twice and in a hospital chapel once and at a funeral home for 3 days straight when his father died. The face that had decided, apparently, that my feelings were a scheduling conflict. I said 2 words. Noted. Enjoy dinner. I picked up my fork and finished my meal. Cleared my plate. Brought dessert. Made coffee. I gave nothing away. When they left at 4 o'clock, my son hugged me in the doorway and said, "Talk soon." I said, "Drive safe." I closed the door. I did not cry. The tears were there, sitting just behind my sternum like something solid, but I didn't let them out because something had changed at that table. Something quiet and fundamental and irreversible, like a structural shift inside a building that looks exactly the same from the outside, but will never bear the same weight again. I went to bed and lay in the dark in the room I had shared with my husband for 31 years, and I thought about the word noted. I had said it reflexively, but lying in the dark, I turned it over and realized it was exactly right. I had recorded it, filed it in the place where you keep things that are true, and now I was going to act accordingly. Let me tell you who I am, because my son didn't know. That's not a small statement. It's just the truth. He knew the version of me that cooked his meals and paid his tuition and showed up when he called. He didn't know the rest of it. I spent 38 years as a forensic accountant. If you don't know what that means, let me give you the version that fits in a sentence. I found money that powerful people had tried to make disappear. I followed numbers through shell companies and offshore accounts and falsified records, and I found the money, and I documented it, and I testified to what I found in federal court on 4 separate occasions, and I was never, not once, wrong. I started in the early 1980s doing standard audit work. I was methodical and precise, and I had an instinct for when something didn't add up that my supervisors used to describe as almost unsettling. One of them once said I could smell a discrepancy from the other side of a filing cabinet. When my son was 4 years old, I was recruited to join a forensic accounting division contracted to assist a federal task force investigating financial fraud in the municipal construction industry. My husband and I talked about it for 2 weeks before I accepted. It meant longer hours, occasional travel, and work that was sometimes adversarial. Sometimes the people whose books I was examining were dangerous in ways that went beyond professional risk. I took the job. Over the next 3 decades, I built a career I remain genuinely proud of. Pension fraud, insurance fraud, healthcare billing fraud, 2 asset concealment cases, and high-value divorce proceedings that became curriculum at 3 universities. The last 12 years I spent as an independent consultant contracted directly by federal agencies. I chose my cases. I set my rates. I answered to nobody but the evidence. I retired to care for my husband when his neurological condition was diagnosed. That was a decision I made without hesitation and without regret. He was my person. He died on a Tuesday in March, 2.5 years before my son told me to be quiet. After his death, I filled the role that was available. The nearby, reliable parent. The one who watched the dogs. The one who covered things. The one who always picked up. I filled that role for 2 years. Then my son put down his fork. The morning after the dinner, I got up at 6, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I wrote down every financial contribution I had been quietly making to my son and his wife's life. Their streaming accounts, I was the account holder, had been for years. A storage unit full of furniture they couldn't fit but wouldn't get rid of. I'd been covering that monthly fee without comment for 2 years. And the car insurance. That started as a 2-month favor 2 Christmases ago. The tight stretch had become 26 months. They had never once mentioned it. I canceled all of it in one sitting, 40 minutes. Felt lighter with every confirmation email. Then I looked at the Sunday dinner. dinners. 40 years. I want that number to land. 40 years of planning Thursday, shopping Friday, cooking through Saturday, table set by 1 o'clock Sunday, pot roasts, lasagnas, homemade rolls every single time. He never asked how long it took. I think he assumed Sunday dinner simply appeared, the way heat comes from a vent. You never think about the furnace. I sent one text. Sunday dinners are on pause indefinitely. Hope you're well. No explanation. No door left open. He didn't respond for 4 days. When he did, it was 3 words. Okay, sounds good. I read it once and went out to the garden. Then I called a locksmith. New front lock, new back lock, new garage code. When he asked why, I told him the old ones were sticking. The truth was mine to keep. I want to explain the locks because it might seem extreme. His wife had let herself into my house twice in the past year without calling first. Once to drop off mail. Once because she was in the neighborhood and wanted to use my printer. She had let herself in, used my printer, and left. I hadn't said anything at the time. Filed it in the same place I'd filed the car insurance and the storage unit and all the other small assumptions that had built into a structure that looked like a relationship but functioned like a service contract. New locks. I stood in my front hallway and turned the new key 3 times just to hear the sound it made. That was the sound of a boundary. I had forgotten what one sounded like. There's a concept in psychology called the gray rock method. The idea is that you become as uninteresting and unresponsive as a pebble on the ground. You don't fight, you don't explain, you don't justify, you simply become unremarkable. I had not planned it, but when I examined what I was doing in the days after the dinner, that was exactly what it was. My son called, I answered briefly and without emotional content. His wife sent a breezy text about a recipe. I replied with a single emoji, neutral, unremarkable, gray. I wasn't doing it to punish them. I was doing it because I was genuinely no longer willing to perform warmth for people who had told me my warmth was too much for them. They had asked for less of me. I was honoring the request. What I did with the parts of myself I was no longer spending on them is what this story is really about. For the first 3 weeks, I did things I hadn't done in years. I drove to a bookshop across town and spent 2 hours in it without looking at my phone. I went to a criminology department seminar at the university, a talk on financial crime and municipal government, and found it so interesting that I introduced myself to the speaker afterward and ended up in a 90-minute conversation that left me feeling more intellectually alive than I had in 2 years. I started going to the pool 3 mornings a week. I had swum competitively in college. The first morning I got in the lane and pushed off the wall. I cried a little into the water and nobody saw. I called an old colleague. We had worked together on a pension fraud case in the mid-90s. She'd stayed in the field and was now running a boutique forensic firm. We talked for 2 hours. She asked several times whether I had any interest in coming back in any capacity. I said I was thinking about it. That was the first time I had said that out loud. It was also, as it turned out, the call that set the rest of this story in motion. About 6 weeks after the dinner, I received a call from a Chicago area code I didn't recognize. The voicemail was professional and brief. The managing director of a private firm specializing in financial forensics and federal compliance consulting. My name had been passed along. The firm had been trying to find someone with my background for the better part of 2 years. I called him back the following morning. He was direct. He explained that the firm was building out a senior consulting division focused on federal asset recovery, the kind of investigative work that requires deep institutional knowledge and an established courtroom record. They had looked at a number of candidates. None of them had the combination they needed. I spent 20 minutes walking him through not just what I knew, but where I thought the field was heading, what the evidentiary challenges were in the current regulatory environment, and 2 case structures I had been thinking through since the university seminar. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. He said, I'd like to send you something. The folder arrived 3 days later by courier. I brought it to the kitchen table and opened it with my coffee. The offer was $350,000 annually, base salary. On top of that, full benefits, travel allowance, and a signing bonus that on its own was more than I had ever earned in a single year at the peak of my career. There was also a letter. He had written it himself. I could tell from the slightly uneven margins and the specific reference to something I had said during our call about the gap between financial regulation as written and financial regulation as enforced. He had been listening. He had written it down. He wanted me to know. I read the entire package twice. Then I put it back in the folder, slid it into my nightstand under a library book I was in the middle of, and told no one. Not my neighbor, not my sister, not my son. The offer was mine. It belonged to me in a way that nothing had belonged to me in a long time. I had spent 2 years making decisions around other people's needs. I wanted to sit with this one by myself before anyone else knew it existed. What I thought over the following weeks was complex. The money was extraordinary and also, in the deeper accounting of my life, almost beside the point. My house was paid for. My pension was stable. What was not beside the point was the search itself. The fact that someone had spent 2 years looking for me, had listened to me talk and responded with genuine recognition, had written a letter because he wanted me to know he'd been paying attention. My son had sat at my table for 40 years and never asked what I actually did for a living. I don't say that to wound anyone. I say it because the contrast between those 2 things needed to be held, examined, and set down somewhere honest before I made any decisions. My son had his own problems. His logistics consulting firm had been quietly bleeding for most of the year. I had gathered this the way I always gathered information, through careful observation of what was said and more careful observation of what wasn't. The expensive apartment. The way he described clients without specifics. The frequency with which his wife mentioned cutbacks framed as choices rather than necessities. The car insurance. After the dinner, I watched differently, with the detachment of someone who has removed herself from the story. What I saw saw was a man under financial pressure who had been offloading his stress onto whatever emotional infrastructure was closest. That infrastructure was me. He had been clipped and distracted for months. The requests had increased in frequency while the warmth in the delivery had decreased. And then he sat at my table and said the quiet part out loud. What I don't think he understood was how much he had been counting on me as a financial stabilizer without naming it that way. Collectively, and more importantly psychologically, I had been a buffer. Reliable, persistent, the kind you stop worrying about because it's always been there. When I pulled the buffer, the exposure was sudden. His partner called me in early November. A straightforward man, unpretentious in the way of people who have worked hard for everything. He said he was worried. They had a debt obligation coming due in the first quarter, and their revenue wasn't positioned to cover it without refinancing or new capital. 2 investment conversations ongoing. Uncertain. I listened. I didn't offer anything. My son called 3 times before December. I answered twice, kept it brief. Fine. Quiet. Busy. He said he had something he wanted to discuss in person. He'd check his schedule. He did not get back to me. I noted that too. December was quiet. I mean that in the literal sense. The absence of Sunday dinner preparation gave the weekends an unusual spaciousness. For the first few weeks, it felt like forgetting something. That feeling passed. I went back to the pool. By December, I had my form back well enough that a younger woman in the adjacent lane asked where I had trained. I told her I hadn't trained since 1976. She looked at me with an expression I will keep. My old colleague kept asking about the offer. She knew the Chicago firm's reputation. She said I would be a fool not to take it. I told her I was still thinking. She said I was always still thinking and I should let myself want something for a change. I thought about that for a week. I was not going to take the job. The reason had nothing to do with stubbornness or games. It was a decision I arrived at slowly and honestly after examining what I actually wanted. What I wanted was not to rebuild my career inside a corporate structure, however generous the terms. What I wanted was what I had been finding in the pool and the seminar room and the notebook, where I wrote analysis for an audience of one. Engagement, relevance, the specific satisfaction of bringing expertise to a place where it was genuinely needed. My old colleague had mentioned a small nonprofit that provided financial oversight and fraud prevention to community organizations, nonprofits, neighborhood associations, small municipal bodies, organizations perpetually under-resourced and perpetually exposed to the kind of quiet financial manipulation nobody investigates because nobody with the right skills ever looks. I called their director in December. We talked for an hour. I went to meet her the following week in an office above a dry cleaning shop that smelled like solvent and had a filing system that made me want to sit down and reorganize it on the spot. She was a former public defender, sharp and pragmatic and tired in the way of someone doing important work without adequate resources. She wasn't asking for money or a famous name. She was asking for someone who knew how to look at a set of books and find the thing that didn't belong. I knew how to do that. I called her back 4 days later and said I'd like to start. The $350,000 offer was still in my nightstand. I looked at it once more and left it there. I was not ready to decline it yet. There was still a part of the story that hadn't finished laying out, and I had learned over 38 years that it is always worth waiting to see what a person does when the pressure actually arrives. My son showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening in early January. I saw his car from the kitchen window, walked to the porch, and waited at the top of the steps. He came to the bottom of them. His hands were in his coat pockets. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something on the drive over and was now deciding whether to use it. He said he'd been trying to reach me. I said I knew. He said things had been stressful. I said I understood. He waited for the door to open, metaphorically and literally. He was waiting for the version of me that had always been available regardless of what preceded the arrival. That version had filed her paperwork and retired. I stood on the porch. I did not open the door. I was not cruel. I was simply present the way a gray rock is present. Unremarkable, unresponsive in the way that removes the invitation. He looked up from the bottom step and I saw a small recalibration in his expression. He had expected the door to open and it hadn't. He said he'd call soon and get dinner sometime. I said that sounded good. He went back to his car. I watched him drive away, then went inside and made tea. He called twice more before the end of January. I answered, kept it brief. His wife called once, manufactured warmth in her voice, suggested a restaurant, said she'd follow up. She didn't. I noted that. The call I was not expecting came in the last week of January. His partner again. He said things had come to a head. Their institutional lender had declined to proceed. The timeline was now weeks, not months. 2 conversations ongoing. One with a private equity contact. One with a Chicago firm that did direct investment in mid-market service businesses. He paused. He said, the second one, I think you might know something about them. I said I was listening. He said the Chicago firm had expressed preliminary interest. Their model involved deploying capital in parallel with consulting expertise. They looked for businesses that needed both, and they had been in extended contact with someone whose professional background matched mine very closely. Another pause. He said, from what I can gather, this person is the reason they're interested in us at all. If she formalizes her arrangement with them, they see it as the validation that makes the investment make sense. If she doesn't, he stopped. Then, I think the conversation ends. He said, I like you. I always have. I thought you deserved to know the full picture. I looked out the kitchen window. The roses were cut back to their canes in the January light. I said, I appreciate you calling me directly. He said, whatever you decide, it's yours to decide. I just wanted you to have all of it. We said goodbye. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I had the folder in my nightstand. I had known for 2 months what it meant. I had deliberately kept my son's situation out of my thinking because I did not want the decision to be about him. I wanted it to be about me. Now it was all on the table. If I took the offer. The investment likely proceeded. The business restructured. The story resolved the way everyone had probably expected. The capable, reliable mother coming through, regardless of how she'd been treated. If I didn't, the outcome was uncertain and was not mine to control. I sat with that. Then I picked up the phone and called the nonprofit director. I asked if the position was still open. She said yes. Was I ready to say yes? I said I was. She asked when I could start. I said Monday. My son called on a Thursday evening in mid-February. The double call, twice in quick succession. The signal that means this is urgent, and I know you saw the first one. I answered the second. He said he'd found out about the offer. His partner had told him enough. He knew about the Chicago firm. He knew the investment conversation was connected. He asked why I hadn't told him. I said the offer was mine and the decision was mine. He said this was different. It affected his livelihood, people who worked for them. He had a right to know. I let that sit. Then I said, you had every opportunity to ask me what I'd been doing with my time in any conversation over these months. You never asked. He said that wasn't the point. I said I thought it was exactly the point. He said he was struggling. Business in real trouble. Too proud to say it directly. He was saying it now. He needed help and he was asking. I said I heard him. He asked, so will you take it? I said I had already made my decision. He asked what it was. I told him I had taken a position, not the Chicago offer, a different one, with a nonprofit I had been working with for several weeks. The silence lasted long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call was still connected. He said, you turned it down. The $350,000. I said yes. He asked why. His voice had changed. The careful quality was gone. Why would you walk away from that? I said, because the position I took is where my expertise is most needed. The Chicago firm would have used my skills to generate revenue for clients who already have resources. The organization I'm working with now is looking at cases where community members lost money they couldn't afford to lose to people who knew nobody was watching. I spent my career watching. That's where I want to be. He said, but we needed you. I said, I know. He said, doesn't that matter? I said, it does. It matters more than you know. But needing someone and valuing them are different things. You didn't know what I did for a living. You sat at my table for 40 years and never asked. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's the true answer to your question. A long silence. Then quietly, I'm sorry about what I said at dinner. I've thought about it a lot. I said I knew. I said I believed him. He said, what do I do now? I said, you figure it out. You are 52 years old and you have a partner who cares about the business. That's what adults do. You figure it out. He was quiet. Then, will you have dinner with me sometime? No agenda. Just dinner. I said yes. Call me and we'll find a date. He said sorry again. I said goodnight. I hung up and stood in my kitchen in the quiet that is mine now, the quiet I chose, and I stayed there for a while. The housing association case I was working resolved in the third week of February. I had built a complete evidentiary file, transaction records, invoice comparison, the contractor's original registration documents against the altered tax ID number, a timeline showing exactly when the diversion started and how much had been taken. Just over $62,000 from an organization operating on $180,000 a year. I presented the findings to the board on a Thursday evening. 8 people around a folding table in the basement of a church. A retired teacher. A young woman in healthcare administration with 2 small children. A man in his 70s who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. I walked them through the documentation methodically, without excess drama. Told them what had happened, who the evidence pointed to, what their options were. The man in his 70s looked at the paperwork for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me and said, how long have you been doing this kind of work? I said 38 years. He said, why are you here for free? I said, because this is where the work needs to be done. He nodded once. The nod of a man who accepts things without requiring them to be further explained. They filed the referral. The district attorney's financial crimes unit opened a case. The investigator assigned told me my initial referral package was the clearest he had ever received. I had 2 more cases already open. By the end of March, there would be 4. I had dinner at my son's apartment in March. He cooked. I want to tell you that because it matters. He called and asked if I would come and he wanted to make dinner himself. He called the week before to ask how long I cooked the pot roast and at what temperature. I told him. He wrote it down. The table was small with a folding extension. The rolls were from the bakery. I didn't say anything about the rolls. We ate and we talked. He asked about the nonprofit work, specific questions, follow-up questions. I watched him do it, and I thought about the difference between people who are interested in you and people who are interested in what you represent to them. He asked what the federal contract work had been like, what testifying was like. I told him about the first time, a federal courtroom, opposing counsel probing my methodology for 2.5 hours, and the prosecutor shaking my hand in the hallway afterwards saying she had never seen an expert witness stay that calm. He said, I didn't know any of that. I said, I know. He said, I should have asked. I said, yes. A quiet moment, not uncomfortable. The kind that comes when a true thing has been said, and both people are letting it settle. He asked if I regretted not taking the Chicago offer. I said no. He asked why not, honestly. I said, because the question of whether I was valuable was never in doubt. The people who searched 2 years for me had already answered that. What I needed to answer was what I wanted to do with that value. And I answered it. I'm doing it. He was quiet. Then, I'm glad you're doing it. I looked at him across the small table. He looked like his father around the eyes. He always had. I could see the boy he had been and the man he'd become and the man he was still deciding to be. I said, so am I. We had dessert, a bakery pie, not the same as mine. I ate a full slice and said it was good. The way you can mean something that isn't quite accurate because what you mean is not the quality of the pie but the fact of the effort. We did the dishes together, which we had not done in a very long time. I drove home at 9 o'clock, pulled into my driveway and sat in the dark for a minute. My house was exactly the right size. The investigator on the Parks Commission case called me 2 months later. The full diversion there turned out to be more than twice what I had initially estimated. A second layer buried inside a vendor relationship I had flagged but not yet fully untangled. He said the case was going to result in charges. He said he'd never seen a cleaner evidentiary trail. He said that in his 12 years in financial crimes, he had occasionally seen consultants like me walk into cases from the outside, but that I was the only one who had ever handed him something that needed no translation. I thanked him and hung up and noted the afternoon sun in the backyard and went back to the next case. I had not taken the $350,000. I had not spent the winter being quiet. I had spent it being exactly what I had always been, in exactly the place where it mattered, with exactly the amount of noise the work required. My son had asked me to be quiet. I noted it. Then I gave my voice to every room where it was actually needed.